Okay, shall we start? Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming through the almost rain. I'm Simon Lister. I'm part of the organising committee. Tonight we're going to talk about a massive event or series of events in China, 700 million and counting, the urbanization of China. Now, this topic doesn't involve all the skills that we are used to talking about in the science group here, but there's quite a lot of other areas which we know something about. Urban development, I don't think we've ever talked about urban development in this particular group. Although there is actually a course in the HLSI on urban development. Demography, we talk about a little bit. We had Paul Morland earlier in the year who gave us a good talk. China itself, frankly, it's often mentioned, but we're not experts on China at all. We never examined it in any detail. And particularly the sheer strangeness of China, in a way, we are very unfamiliar with. As the Economist put it the other day, it is an engineering state, or a place ruled by engineers, which sort of brings us back to the science group a bit. This being ruled by engineers, and I'm sure the speaker is going to go into a lot of detail on that, gives great strength to the Chinese government, but also potential for catastrophes and disasters. I didn't know that the person who invented the one-child policy was, in fact, a leading missile engineer. Perhaps that's why he didn't hit the target. Okay, to help us explore this big topic, and bearing in mind we're not tremendously knowledgeable about many of the topics here, we are very lucky to have with us Professor Chris Hamnett to speak to us today. He's known to many of us here. He's a local friend of quite a lot of the audience. He has very wide experience in housing issues, involvement in China as well, the housing and social policy. And he's a well-known figure in that particular business. He's researched a whole range of interesting topics: housing, wealth, inheritance, social polarization, gentrification, and he is regarded as one of the leading experts in the field. Chris was also a professor. He was professor of geography at King's for many years, and he's also a visiting professor at Renmin University in China, and was a similar position in Chengdu. So we have a very distinguished speaker. So really, that's all I want to say. Welcome, Chris, to speak to us tonight, and over to you, Chris.
Thank you. Okay, lovely. So I've got lots of slides and lots of pictures. But before I start, just very quickly, how many of you have been to China? Oh, right, almost everybody. Okay. How many of you have been to China in the last 4 or 5 years? Excellent, almost nobody. How many of you have worked in China for, 20 years or so? Nobody, good. That's really excellent news. So I didn't want an audience of, of old China hands who...
I wasn't reading anything.
You never mind, you be quiet, Simon, I don't need to hear that, thank you. Right, so lots of pictures, because I think this is a subject which really needs illustration. Now, I've called it 750 million and counting, and if you look at the latest figures, which claim to show the urban population of China, they say it's actually 940 million. But I don't think it's quite that big, as I'll explain. But one of the really important things, I think, to note is everybody here, I'm sure, you all know the population of Britain, it's 70 million. The population of China is 1.4 billion, so it's approximately 20 times more people than there are here in Britain, just to give you an idea of the size of the country. Now, the reason I asked whether people have been to China is to, in a sense, try to get your image of what China is, because I think many of us, when we think back, we think to the paddy fields, the rice sowing, Chairman Mao, the Great Wall, etc. But China has changed enormously in the last 40 years. So the China shown in these, if you like, propaganda posters, really, in many ways, ended with Chairman Mao, though, of course, Xi Jinping has reintroduced very much a new cult of personality, but that's a different ballgame. This is just a few words about me. So I first went to China with my wife and children, actually, in August 89, 6 weeks after Tiananmen Square. We didn't know, really, it'd been Tiananmen Square, so we were in Hong Kong en route to Australia, and we'd already pre-booked a tour into the Pearl River Delta, and, well, we thought, well, let's go. So we went. Of course, at that stage, very lucky to have gone then, because virtually everybody was still on bicycles, very, very few cars. The area around Guangzhou and Shenzhen was still really rice paddy and water buffalo, whereas today Shenzhen's got a population of maybe 15 million people. So then I was lucky enough to go to Shanghai in '95, and then really after I retired from King's, the visits just increased, and as Simon kindly said, so I've had visiting professorships in Shanghai, Ningbo, Chengdu, and then most recently Renmin University. And then earlier this year, I visited, as it were, the dragon in its den and went to Wuhan, of course, the site of the COVID virus. People there are quite surprised that Wuhan is how can one describe the image of Wuhan now in Western imagery? It's a very problematic place, but the residents of Wuhan are unaware, if you like, of how the city is viewed in the West. So anyway, the scale and the speed of the transformation, I think, of modern China can't be overestimated. And it's gone, I'm sorry if essentially reading this, but it's gone from one of the poorest countries in the world in the 1950s and under Mao to really the world's second largest economy in the space of about 40 or 45 years. And as you probably know, Deng Xiaoping started the modernization of China with his reform and opening up in 1978. Since then, the economy of China has grown sixfold in real terms, and I've been, in a sense, privileged to be able to see part of that transformation. But one of the most important and fascinating aspects of this modernization has been the urbanization of China. And I think it's undoubtedly the biggest process of urbanization that the world has ever seen, possibly the most rapid, although the urbanization of Britain from the 1840s to the 1880s, similar sort of period, and of the USA from maybe 1880 to 1920 was very similar. But the scale of this in China has been absolutely astonishing. And China's always had some big cities, but historically the populations were far smaller than they are today, and the areas, of course, were much less extensive. So China today has got over 100 cities with 1 million people in each. And it's also got about 15 cities which are called sort of hyper-large cities, which is a population of over 10 million people. So the size of some of the cities in China really, in a sense, beggars belief. One of the things which constantly fascinates me is the number of Chinese students we have coming to Britain. They go to places like, I don't know, it could be Manchester or Leeds, but if you imagine Luton or Bedford or Middlesbrough. Now, these places, the latter three, these would just count as large villages in China. So the notion that they're coming to, to study in an English city or Norwich or Exeter, I mean, I just have no idea how they view these places, sort of quaint little 19th century relics. So this gives you the size, effectively, it's not quite accurate actually, of some of the biggest cities in China, and the top 15 or so. And Shanghai is the biggest, then Guangzhou, Beijing, Shenzhen, Wuhan, Chengdu, but I'll talk about Chengdu a little bit later on. Chongqing, all of the names in a sense don't matter. The point is the sheer size of the cities. That's what's so important and interesting. There's obviously a geographical distribution of the cities, and you can see from this map that the great majority, of course, of them are in the east, the most economically developed part of China, and in the middle of China. And there are really very few cities of any size in the west of China. This is Xinjiang province up here, which many of you will have heard about, where the Chinese are basically running internment camps for the Muslim population and with forced labor, etc. And that's the major city of Zhejiang province. And my wife and I were lucky enough to be able to visit Ulaanbaatar in 2017. Tibet, regrettably, I've never managed to get into, but I was based here in Chengdu in Sichuan province for about a month or two every year between 2017 and 2019. But you can see pretty clearly the urban concentration of China, and the population, of course, of China is really very much concentrated in the eastern half. So again, this is simply another graph. This is a more accurate one, showing the size of cities. Shanghai is about 24, 25 million. Beijing's about 22, 23 million, etc. And then down here, you've got a tail of cities with 4 or 5 million, and that just simply extends. I haven't bothered to extend the graph. You don't need to see any more. Now, I mentioned earlier, there's some problems in my view about the size of Chinese cities, because I think the figures can be very misleading for the reason that they generally refer to the municipal administrative area, which can and does extend very significantly beyond the city. So in Chengdu, the administrative boundary of the city now extends out to about 40 kilometres outside the city and includes all of these small towns. And much of the land is actually rural agricultural, scattered with occasional tower blocks. And again, Chongqing, which is allegedly the biggest city in the world at 35 million, I would say it's about 15 or 16 million, but the administrative area of the city is simply so big that it includes a number of other urban areas. And there's a reason for this, which is promotion within the Chinese political hierarchy, and if you like, the Chinese civil service hierarchy, is to a large extent based on your economic success. How good you are at generating growth in the city or the province of which you are a leader. And one of the key ways in which people do this is simply by expanding the administrative area and saying, well, you know, the population of Chengdu has gone from 10 to 15 million. But in my view, the population of Chengdu is still, you know, only about 10 million people. Nonetheless, still significantly bigger than London. This actually is a map of, this is a huge agricultural area here around Chengdu, and you have coming down from the north a branch of a major source actually of the Yangtze River, which leaves the mountains up here in Dianjian, and then spreads out over this huge agricultural plain, or what used to be an agricultural plain, because in my view, tragically, a huge area has now simply been taken up by this expanding urban area. But basically, you may be able to see here, it says 6th planned road, 5th ring road, and I think the administrative area of Chengdu now extends right out to include all of these peripheral cities. So you can see how it's possible for people to say that the city has a population of 15 million. So why has China's urban population grown so much? Well, there's a number of reasons. The first, obviously, is this very rapid process of opening up and of national economic growth. The second is the huge, well, the growth initially began in the major cities in the east of China, particularly south and east of China, particularly in Shanghai and Guangzhou. And it was fueled, if you like, by really major rural to urban migration. So in most of the Western European countries, post-Second World War, we've all had major immigration, labour migration, but whereas some of the migration, for example, in Italy, came from the south to the north, and in some of the migration within Europe into, say, France, came from Spain and Portugal and Italy, and into Germany, a lot of it came from Turkey. Almost all of the migration within China has been internal, and it's come from rural areas to urban areas. And the best estimate is that perhaps 200 million of the urban population are rural in migrants. The third reason, as I've already mentioned, is this local government desire to grow for political and financial reasons. And a fourth and very major reason is that it's been a key element of government policy to shift population from what they see as low productivity agriculture to higher productivity manufacturing and services. So the government has explicitly wanted to increase the size of the urban population as part of its strategy to modernize China. This shows you, it's out of date, but it doesn't matter, the changing rural and urban distribution of population in China. The yellow graphs are the rural population. This is 1950. The red lines are the urban population. So in 1950, about almost 90% of the population of China was rural. Okay, so hence our images of the paddy fields, etc. And then you can see gradually, but actually quite rapidly, the way in which the share of the urban population grows from 12% to whatever, to 20, etc. Now, on that graph, I think it's shown today as being about 50-something percent. The latest figures suggest that it's 66% urban, but again, I believe that's an inflated figure because of this artificial urban bounding. But what's clear has been the huge increase in the size of the urban population. These are some pictures of the migrants, the labour migrants coming from rural China into the big cities, and you don't see so many of these pictures anymore. One of the things I remember quite dramatically around the year 2000, and I did gone with my wife and we were visiting Xi'an, which is where the Terracotta Army is. And there's a roundabout outside the walls, and as we neared the roundabout, our hotel was inside the walls. There were literally hundreds of men, and they were almost all men, sitting down, but they were holding implements. Some were holding saws, others were holding hammers, etc. And basically they were saying, I'm a carpenter, I'm a bricklayer, blah, blah, blah. And they were basically rural workers waiting to be hired. And I have one other strong memory, probably, around that time, maybe, around the year 2000, in Shanghai, of taking a train journey from Shanghai down to Ningbo. This was before the introduction of the Gaotie, the high-speed train network. And as we approached the station, there were people walking up to it, bent over with refrigerators on their backs. And these were, of course, people taking home the fruits of their labour. This was the modernization of China on the move. You don't, of course, see that anymore, but it was very striking to see that. Now, of course, as a consequence of all of this, the old urban China has disappeared at a very, very rapid rate, far too rapidly, I think. And a lot of the old neighborhoods, what used to be called the Lilong in Shanghai and the Hutong in Beijing, have all been rapidly torn down and replaced. Socially, this is hugely disruptive, although most of them were and still are in very, very poor condition, without piped water or toilets. So again, even in 2000, when I visited the old city of Shanghai, they were still bringing carts, if you like, in the morning to collect the night soil because there were basically no private toilets, and at that stage virtually no public toilets in the old city. So, don't need to see that. This is an image really of old Beijing from, I don't know when, 1910, something of that date. And you can see the city walls still intact. Oh, actually, I will go back here because this map, this German map actually, which shows the old city of Beijing with the walls here. And one of the first things Mao did, I think in about 1950 or 53, is to demolish all of the walls around the city of Beijing and to basically build a moat around part of it around the north. And that's now, this is what's termed the second ring road. So everything was demolished to form the second ring road. There's still a couple of cities, maybe more, in China which still have the walls intact. Xi'an is one, apparently Nanjing still has its walls, but basically everything has gone in Beijing, although some of the, all of obviously the Forbidden City here is still completely intact, and the Temple of Heaven, etc., and all of the drum tower and the bell tower, they're all still going. But this is a picture of Beijing, probably I think in about the 1950s, and you can see the classic housing style with internal courtyards. This is now basically, I would say, probably an 8-lane highway, which is simply constantly clogged with cars. And this is a map of the Beijing of today. This is the old second ring road around the old city. Then they built the third ring road. Where's Renmin University? Let's see if I can make this work. Oh, look at that, wonderful. So that's where Renmin University was, right by a subway station. So I was quite lucky to be there. But now they've got the 5th ring road, there's a 6th ring road, and massive urban expansion. And one of the things I'll talk about in a moment is the huge decentralization of universities out of the center of all of the Chinese cities. So Renmin University, which is here, is being moved out to Tongzhou out here, along with a lot of the city government and, strangely enough, a very large police station. We can think about the reason for the links about that later on. So if we look at, for example, the transformation of Shanghai, and I do have a lot of pictures, I think, coming up. Shanghai, probably most of you know, is famous for its waterfront, the Bund, where the Western ships were tying up from the 1850s onwards. And then in the period up to the Second World War, it saw the building of a lot of major bank buildings, HSBC and the Standard Chartered and so on. So this is the Bund in Shanghai, I guess sometime in the late 19th century, and you can see all of the boats. These are the rather wonderful buildings that were constructed in the early years, I think, of the 20th century, somewhat similar actually to the waterfront of Liverpool. And this has fortunately all been retained, and of course it's a wonderful tourist attraction. This shows the Shanghai probably around 1985, something like this. I show this to Chinese audiences and say, which city is this? And they scratch their heads. They absolutely have not got a clue. And this is the part of the river that feeds into the Yangtze. And this is the site called Puxi, and that's Pudong. And it's Pudong which has seen all of the urban development. So if I show you the next slide, this is modern Shanghai. I was lucky to get to see it before most of this was put up. They'd only built the TV tower. But if I go back, I think probably these are my favorite 2 slides. And you can see exactly, here's the here's one of the old buildings on the Bund there, and you can go back and you can see it here. So this is not visual trickery. And of course, at that stage, there were no bridges over the river. So there's now 2 really big bridges have been constructed. You had to get across either by a pedestrian tunnel under the river or by a small ferry. Again, another shot of modern Shanghai. This is one of the old hutong of Beijing, which in the process of being demolished, They're basically single-storey houses, as I say, no sanitation, no water. Wonderful from a tourist point of view to visit, but I think the reality is not terribly attractive in terms of living. But some very privileged people now, wealthy people, are able to, if they're really lucky and well connected, to purchase hutong houses and to courtyard houses and to modernize them. So they're living, effectively, it would be living in Mayfair or something, the equivalent in London, but in really old housing. Now, these are pictures of, this is traditional housing in Shanghai, but you can see the high-rise buildings going up. I probably took these about 1995, so about 30 years ago. And again, you can see all of the street life, the street markets. The next picture, I think, will give you an indication. You know what these are? Good guess, but no. Next one. Frogs. Frogs. So this sort of, the wet markets, as it were, of China are quite, or used to be quite renowned. So you walk along the streets and all of this, everything is moving and squirming in the baskets. So hence the big debate, you know, about the origin of COVID, whether it started from the bats in transmission between animals in the wet market in Wuhan, or whether it came out of the lab. This is really close to the last 2 or 3 pictures. So you can see they're taking down, or have taken down, a lot of the old housing, 1-, 2-story, and being replaced with these high-rise apartment buildings. So this is looking over the water to Pudong. Again, you can see here the old-style housing, the new city rising on the other side of the river. There's very, very little of this left now. It's sad, but there we go. These pictures show some of the demolition process taking place in Shanghai and what used to be, I think, probably the former French concession area, where you had a lot of almost European-style housing. And at one stage in the mid-90s, a lot of that was demolished and replaced, but a lot of it actually in the centre of Shanghai is still extant, which means now that that area of Shanghai has got the same ambience, the same feel as, say, Covent Garden has in London. It's become a tremendous centre of tourist attraction, and rightly so, because it's very, very attractive. But you can see here the juxtaposition of the old housing coming down and the new towers which had all gone up on the other side. Of course, Pudong, the other side, this is the planned financial centre of Shanghai, and the key point to stress, of course, is it was planned. It's not happened by accident or by the result of market forces. This is central government decision, local government managed land acquisition policy, clearance policy, movement out of the population, forcible movement, and redevelopment. These pictures are of a city, I guess now about 2 hours from Shanghai by high-speed train, Ningbo. This is where, as you know, we get a lot of goods from China. And a lot of them, I mean, some will come from Hong Kong, some from Shanghai, but Ningbo is a really, really major container port. And the old areas, again, just have been torn down and, let's see. Wait a minute, let's get right back here. I've missed, one of the pictures. So there's some historic preservation here, or renovation of some of the old buildings. And this is absolutely classic, the level of crowding, if you like, in these areas almost every day of the week. But you can see the key thing I think I want to draw attention to is the high-rise luxury apartment buildings going in. This is not social housing, this is market housing for sale. And again, here. So one of the key things is that virtually all of the city governments in China compete with one another in terms of economic growth, population growth, and as I said earlier, successful development can mean national promotion for city leaders. So very often, the top party leaders in China have all come from being, if you like, the party secretary of Shanghai or the mayor of Beijing or etc. or Chengdu, and there is a very clear hierarchy, and people move up that. So one of the key elements is in many of these cities, Chengdu as an example, that they have now constructed these huge new areas. They're new technology parks. A big one in Chengdu is called Tianfu, but most of the big Chinese cities have got these huge new areas. Tianjin, east of Beijing, has got a new area which, I don't know how to put it, maybe 10 times the size of Canary Wharf, 20 times. Much of it is still empty, actually, because this is a big problem with Chinese urban development. They've built, and then the problem is that, well, they've overbuilt, and the problem is filling it. And they've been built using vast amounts of local government debt and financed by land sales, and a lot of these developments have now stalled. Some of you will have, I'm sure, read about the problems of the big Chinese property developers. Evergrande is one of the biggest. They've now basically gone into administration owing billions, perhaps tens of billions of dollars. They've simply massively overexpanded. Oops. So this is some of the new development in Chengdu. This is the technology park. And then they've got this big new water area down to the south. And this is just absolutely normal in virtually every big city in China. And it's not just one area like this. They're developing whole new urban areas. And they have been doing so with strong government encouragement, although that's very much got rolled back in the last couple of years because the scale now of local government debt in China is really quite horrific. In fact, I'm glad to see an audience here this evening. I thought everyone would be at home trying to work out whether your home was worth more than £2 million or not and what you were going to do about it. But the problems in China are on another scale altogether. So along with the new areas, you've got these new city centres which are really quite spectacular, huge shopping malls, temples of consumption. They're often filled, but almost always filled with Western brands. So it's really quite remarkable. You think you're going through the luxury areas of Bond Street or the central areas of Paris around the Place Vendôme, etc. And there's also this this common policy in China of university decentralization out of the city, out to the suburbs or beyond. So virtually every city, so one of the East China Normal University in Shanghai, new campus, hour and a half out of the city, no subway. The University of Electric Science and Technology, UESTC in Chengdu, I had the ill luck, if you like, to be based on the suburban campus, and you can't get into the city except perhaps at weekends. And they're moving out everything from Xi'an, Renmin. One can speculate what the reasons are, I think there's three possibilities. One is that universities are often almost all occupying enormously valuable inner city central sites. So if you can move them out and you can redevelop the campuses for whatever, high-rise luxury housing or offices, there's an enormous increase in value. And if the university can take a slice of that and the city government, blah, blah, blah. The second reason is because almost all Chinese students live on campus and they live in conditions of what we would consider extreme overcrowding. So undergraduates are normally between 4 and 6 to a room, master's students 4 to a room, but you're 2 if you're lucky, and PhD students 2 to a room. And some of the new developments, they're just 2 students to a room, or even students may have their own room. So that's the second reason. The third is simply that if the government is worried about a reoccurrence of Tiananmen Square, basically all of the universities are now outside the cities and they're isolated, and it'd be very easy to surround them with the police and military and shut off any dissent and protest. And I leave you to think which of these might be the more likely. This is shopping centre just very close to the centre of Shanghai. I think it's a most wonderful building. The architecture is simply spectacular. It's just filled with Western luxury Western brands. Very, very few things seem to be sold in these shops, but I spoke to one of the retailers, I can't remember which city, and they said, well, basically the level of the markup is so great that if we just sell 1 or 2 items per day, we can more or less cover costs. So I don't know how true that is, but it's pretty remarkable. And this is one of my favorite photographs. I use this as an image, I think, probably on my Facebook page or something. It's nicely androgynous. And this was in the shopping mall in Shanghai, and of course this type of robot is now increasingly common in China and in a number of ways. But I just think it's a beautiful image. Now, some of you may have heard of ghost cities, and basically these are cities where the buildings have been built, the towers have been built, there's no people there. And this is where you've had over-enthusiastic urban governments, and they've said we must expand, we must develop, we must modernize, growth equals power, we borrow the money, and we'll build the buildings. Now, this is an extreme example. I'm trying to remember the name. City is in Inner Mongolia, Hotan, I think. I'll show you the pictures in a minute. So one of the big problems of urban China is of overdevelopment. Most development is financed by debt. And there's this huge amount of empty housing. And in the last 3 years, China has experienced a real property slump with as many of the large developers have gone bankrupt. And many people, this is, I think, it's a particularly Chinese characteristic. A lot of people in Britain or in America think that investing in property or real estate is a good idea. And some of you do. How many of you get the Sunday Times here? Okay, good show of hands. You probably know the thing that is always on the back of the Business and Money supplement, which is called, I don't know what it's called, something or money. And it always features an individual, and it says, what do you think the best investment is? And most people almost always say property rather than pension. But in China, this is writ large. So basically, if people have got money, what they've put it into is buying apartments. They don't need to let them, they just buy them. And the hope has been that property values would keep increasing, and that, in a sense, this is like money in the bank. The problem in the last 3 or 4 years is that property values have actually fallen rather than increased, and a lot of people have bought apartments off plan. They've put down maybe 25 or 30%, and then the developers failed to complete the development. Of course, people are very angry about that, and this is something the Chinese government are dealing with very seriously, because you don't want 1.4 billion people who all think they've been defrauded in their property investment. So I think that my view is that the Chinese government is happy to let the developers go bankrupt, but they will ensure that the developments are all finished and that people will get their apartment, because the risks of social unrest of not doing that are really so great. So this is, yes, I think this is Hotan in Mongolia. It's an arid area, really north of Beijing, and people have told me, well, these days it's now become quite busy, but I'm not convinced, I have to say. So this is not somewhere I would particularly want to live. I think you probably get an idea of the urban climate from this pictures. Now, yeah, I've been through all of this about the speculative overdevelopment. I'm not going to repeat it. I think you can see very clearly the what's happened here, but it's been on a massive scale. But one of the really interesting things is the phenomenon of, if you like, it's not dispossessed famers, it's actually farmers. That land in China is owned by the state, but rural land is owned by the, as it were, by the commune, but it can be expropriated by local government for urban development in the form of cash or new apartments. So the way in which, this is crucial actually, the way in which city governments in China raise finance, it's not by a poll tax or a property tax. What they do is they take over an area of rural land adjacent to the city, and they compensate the owners at rural property value, which of course would be wonderful if we could do this here, or they say, look, your area of land is so-and-so, we will give you 3 apartments for this. So the local farmers get 3 apartments, typically one of which they will live in, and the other 2 they would then rent out. But the government then sells the land to the developers, but they sell it or they auction it sometimes at an urban land valuation. So there's a massive, 10-fold at least, increase in land value. And this is the main source of revenue for Chinese city government. So the problem at the moment is, with the collapse of the, if you like, the urban property market, the whole basis of income generation for the city governments has, in a sense, stalled. So what's happening in some local governments, I've heard this 2 or 3 cases now, is that the local government are unable to pay their civil servants, or they're saying to them, look, we've been paying you 5,000 RMB a month, but I'm afraid your wage is now going to go down to 2,000 or 1,000 because we basically don't have any money and we can't borrow anymore. But that's the, if you like, the basis of urban financing. But it's really difficult for people who have been farmers for generations, I think, to stop working the land. I mean, these are peasants. What else do? You only know one thing. So all over China, you've got these large new developments, cheek by jowl, with ex-farmers tilling small plots of land and growing a few vegetables. Now, this is some new housing in Ningbo. You can see there, 2016. This is this big port city, a couple of hours from Shanghai. Typical pattern of development. This is all new development, all in the last 3 or 4 years before I took the photographs. And this is absolutely typical. This is on the edge of the urban area. It's probably now been all cleared and all of this will have been developed in turn. But these are effectively, these are dispossessed farmers just growing some vegetables because they don't have other jobs. What else can they do? And I think, I'm not too much of a romantic, but I think basically their attachment to the land is so strong that this is the basis of their being. So this is very, very common. You will see this around not just around, but inside Chinese cities, actually, where they've knocked down old buildings and they've got piles of earth. These areas are now being cultivated. You can see here, this is just a small plot which a farmer, ex-farmer, I think, is working on. So one of the disconcerting things about China is the ruthless, all-pervasive role of the state. I mean, China is a party state. There's no messing about with that. It used to be obviously under Mao, and then around 1978 you saw the opening up, and for a while I was confused, and I thought, well, actually China has now become, if you like, the biggest, the most marked capitalist country in the world. But that actually was an error on my part. What China is characterized by is capitalism under the control of the state and the control of the party. And so basically, when the state decides to redevelop something, people are given a 30-day notice, and that's it, and they have to go. The owners of property would be compensated, or they'd be given replacement accommodation on the periphery of the city, much bigger, new apartments, maybe 2 apartments, but maybe an hour and a half out of the centre. So the breakup of communities has been on a massive scale. And in 2019, the Beijing government decided to clamp down on illegal housing on the periphery of the city. They wanted to uprate the social structure of the city. So these were some of the, if you like, the rural slums occupied by migrant labour on the periphery of Beijing. And basically the city government moved in. They simply started demolishing. You can see people are taking their belongings on their backs. I was lucky. I had a colleague who took me out to see this before the security guards came and told us we shouldn't be taking photographs. But all of this would have been razed within another few days. So people just leaving their belongings, what they couldn't take. So this is indicative indirectly of the power of the state. And these people may have been going to protest, I'm not sure. But this is like the end result, and you can see. You don't get problems of HS2 in China. China has built the most spectacular, modern, totally country-spanning high-speed rail network. It's unimaginably efficient. Of course, the main reason for this is that people are not consulted and they're simply dispossessed. So the lines are just driven through. We've, if you like, make the mistakes here of putting in £100 million bat tunnels. That's not something that bothers the Chinese. Now, I'm coming to an end, because very quickly, I've taken 55 minutes, I think, but there's been quite a lot of, in some Chinese cities, picking up on Western types of urban development. So they have a Thames town near Shanghai, and they've replicated Western urban developments, literally with false St. Mark's squares, Eiffel Towers. So you may say, well, wait a minute, they did this in Las Vegas with the with some of the big casinos, and that's true. But this is a Chinese replication of, if you like, of Bayswater or Pimlico. This is part of Thames Town, where you can see the tower buildings, the faux half timbering. There's not a lot of this, but there's enough. And of course, this is normally would be packed with tourists and visitors. And this, can you believe? This is quite impressive, isn't it? If you can't go to the Tuileries, etc. in Paris, well, just knock one up locally. I have no idea. I didn't take this photograph, by the way, so I have no idea what the scale of the Eiffel Tower is, but clearly not the real deal. One of the big problems, literally 2 minutes to finish here, is that China's this huge, rapid pace of urbanization, the construction quality has often been very, very poor. And I've lived in buildings in Chengdu, where basically all of the tiling is falling off the external walls. So the pavements are all roped off because, you know, the standard of finish was just so poor. And in my view, quite a lot of new buildings are slowly falling apart. I think they're going to have to be torn down. This has got big potential problems for apartment blocks when people have bought the flats. I mean, a lot of the public housing is still, that was privatized about 1995, so that's in an appalling state. But I think a lot of urban China may have to be rebuilt within the next 20 to 30 years. This is an extreme example of where they obviously put a block up, but the foundation quality wasn't quite up to snuff. And you can see it's just toppled over. So this is extreme and it's unfair, but it's illustrative. But then again, you've got, yeah, I will finish on this. This is Shanghai or Beijing? Do you know, I'm not sure. But when I first went to Shanghai in 1995, I was in a hotel on the Nanjing Road, and I drew the curtains, but I couldn't get to sleep because all the time there was all of this blue flashing outside, just constantly. And I realized that what it was is that this was the welders on the steel on the buildings all around, because they worked 24 hours a day. So this was just the steel erectors and the arc lights. So in a sense, China has undergone this unbelievable, huge transformation in the last 40-odd years. It's brought probably 500 million people out of poverty. You cannot imagine the number of cars in China, or indeed the number of coal-fired power stations they're still erecting every year. But perhaps some of the pictures I've shown you give an indication of this transformation, and I'd be very happy to take any questions that you may have. So I'll finish on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
Is that on? So use it on.
Is it on?
It's on.
Is there any homelessness in China?
I'm sorry?
Is there any homelessness in China? Or does everybody get somewhere to live?
The answer to that is yes, but I think it's concealed because what you see is what these days is what the state permits you to see. And I can remember in the early days seeing a lot of limbless people on little trolleys, wheeling beggars basically around the centre of many of the big cities. They've all been moved away, and so you don't see any more. It's not that there are no homeless people. I think they're probably restricted in terms of which areas they're able to live, or indeed they may indeed be moved out of the cities altogether. But of course there's still a problem of, in the older areas, of incredibly low living standards and poor and poverty, etc. But the living standards of hundreds of millions of people have been dramatically improved. But I mean, the answer is yes, but you don't see it anymore. You don't. It's not as visible as here as it is here in London. Yes.
Fascinating evening. I'm wondering what effect this urbanization has had on things like food production.
This is something that concerns me deeply, and I believe also concerns the Chinese government, because most of the urban development has taken place on prime agricultural land. For the whole area around Shanghai is fertile delta land. Beijing less so, but in Chengdu, as I mentioned, it's incredible. Huge area of river silt, all built on. The Chinese government seems to take the view that they will in the future import a lot of their food, and therefore they're now importing very large quantities of soya from Brazil. So one of the indirect causes of deforestation in Brazil is and beef cultivation in Brazil. They've acquired vast areas of land in East Africa, hundreds of thousands of acres, which the plan is to, in a sense, intensify the agriculture there. New Zealand basically supplies a very large proportion of the dairy products for China, and I think increasingly the view, Southeast Asia in general, which is being developed by China, they've now put a railroad down from Kunming in southern China, right down through Laos, down to Cambodia. The Southeast Asia is regarded as a potential rice-growing area. So yes, they're very concerned about it, but it doesn't really seem to have slowed the pace of urban development at all. But it's a big problem. Yes, please.
Thank you. Fascinating. And there are two questions I've got in my mind which are possibly linked. The one-child birth policy, the relaxation of it is going to presumably increase the birth rate. But young people who've got qualified through universities, there are no jobs.
Yeah.
One hears about this frequently. How is this conundrum being addressed?
If you could answer that, or I could answer that, the Chinese government would give us unlimited quantities of wealth. The one-child policy, clearly in retrospect, has been a huge mistake. Virtually every Chinese family I know, or individuals, they're all one-child families. So basically, if you have a married couple these days, they both have two I need to get this right, two pairs of grandparents, as it were, of parents for them to look after. And very often, their grandparents have had to be brought to the cities to help look after the children in the city. So now, in the last, 8 years or so, the Chinese government has realized that this policy is hugely problematic, because it's now estimated that on current trends, that by the end of this century, the population of China could halve from 1.4 billion to 700 million, because the birth rate has basically completely collapsed. And in a sense, the direct reason I think it's collapsed is it's partly to do with the increased standard of living. You look at all of the young people, and the first thing they want is if they can, is a car or an apartment, and foreign holidays. And childcare now is getting more expensive in China. So basically, you have a very large number of, education is the other big thing, of educated young people, particularly educated young women, and they realize that they have all of these other opportunities. They have a career. They can have a nice apartment, holidays abroad. Why would you want to saddle yourself with children? So the population of China, you probably know, has now peaked. The last 3 years it's begun to fall, and that fall, I think, will increase in speed. And they're facing this tremendous problem, and also an associated problem of the aging of the population. So the big question is, what are we going to do with all of these? How are we going to look after our old people? Because in China, as in Japan, but China particularly, the basis of social care has always been familial. So the children's responsibility is to look after the parents, but there aren't enough children anymore. And sometimes the children have moved from rural areas to the cities, and the parents are still stuck in rural poverty. I'm not sure if I've fully answered your question, but I mean, it's an enormous dilemma for the Chinese government.
Okay.
Thank you. There are spectacular examples of feng shui in London. I wondered if you'd found any spectacular examples of feng shui influencing design in China.
No, I've never looked out for it as such, but clearly this is something which is an element or consideration in urban construction or housing construction, etc., in China. And I'm trying to remember, the feng shui, I think, means, is it wind and water? I think those are the two things. So it's not something, to be honest, I've ever really paid any attention to, but it is something which I think Chinese people are conscious about. So they would try, if they could, to get an apartment with some a good sense of feng shui. But actually, when you see the interior layout of many of the apartments, it is so appalling and disastrous that this is not something that the developers have remotely thought about. Their prime consideration is how can we cram in as much space as possible and maximize profits. So, yes.
You were saying earlier about coal still being very
Yes.
important to them, but on the other hand, I think we're being sold the idea that they're well into wind and renewables. How do those two live together?
Well, you're right to raise the question. The answer is in parallel. I think I'm broadly correct. China is probably putting in the rate of construction of which they're putting in new wind farms and solar farms, particularly in the west of China, in Xinjiang province, is absolutely spectacular. So China is the world's biggest producer of solar panels. You also see now in all of the cities a huge increase in electric cars, and all electric cars have a green number plate. In Beijing, 50% of something of the cars now have a green number plate. However, the Chinese are still building, I can't remember whether it's 10 or 20 new coal-fired power stations every year. So, but basically, both of these things are happening in parallel. The Chinese government realize that climate change is a big problem, but they believe that they've got to keep the model of economic development going, because if the great fear would be to have an increase, and the gentleman over there mentioned it, in the number of unemployed young people, and that's happening at the moment because the job market has really tightened up. And China, at the end of the Cultural Revolution, during the Cultural Revolution, all the universities are closed. And then the universities opened. At the moment, China is producing 9 million new university graduates every year, but there aren't 9 million new jobs for them. So the big fear is rising unemployment, because the deal in China has been, you give us jobs, you give us an increase in the standard of living, and it's worked tremendously, and we will keep quiet and keep our nose to the grindstone. I'm being a bit simplified, but that's how things have worked for the last 45 years, and it's been enormously successful. But if it ceases to work, things could rapidly fall apart. Yes?
One reads about the engineers being in charge. Is there a similar sort of group of social planners? It seems to me that they're good at producing railways or whatever the other infrastructure items are, but they're not good at making the thing work from the human point of view.
Well, you're right, Simon, that basically a lot of the senior government members, basically many of them all did engineering degrees at Tsinghua, etc. But maybe they have in the past utilised, if you like, an engineering perspective to problems. But increasingly now there is a big stress on social involvement, social collaboration, but also in, I can't remember the correct name, it's something I find very disturbing, social integration, social order. So basically, households, individuals get points now for doing certain things, and if you do other things, bad things, you have points deducted. And if you have enough points deducted, then you basically can't get mortgages, you possibly couldn't get education, etc. So the Chinese government in the last few years under Xi Jinping has built in an increasing model of social control, which is quite frightening. Leave aside the cameras everywhere. I should have shown you some pictures of those. The facial recognition technology is something to be believed, and of course that has also enabled a huge degree of social control in Xinjiang. But now to get into my, if I may say, my university in China, I have to face the camera. The camera scans my photograph, my face, matches it to the database. You can't get into a railway station without being facially scanned and having your ID document scanned and matched, and that's to ensure that there's no terrorist bombings in railway stations. But it's a surveillance society. Sorry, the gentleman here has been waiting.
Yes, frighteningly surveillance with horrendous capital punishment taking place. It's not a free country by any means. I find it interesting the way you mentioned some of the problems about Chinese aging population, as though it's the only country in the world with that problem. It's actually it's an increasing problem, and even India, which had a huge population explosion, that's not the case anymore. That is reducing. The rate of increase is reducing. So the rate of increase of the world's population is increasing. Yeah. I believe they do allow a few, some immigration into China, some of it from India, and I could see that becoming more common.
Well, there's two issues here. I think the rate of growth of the world's population is declining, and I think people think it will, I mean, you may think this is horrific, it will stabilize at around 10 billion people by the end of this century. What problems that will bring, we don't know. But you're right that there has been an increasing amount of immigration into China initially it's been of high-tech experts and of Western experts initially. So all of the construction workers, all rural Chinese from the interior, but they've had an increasing number of Western experts. But now, given the Chinese expansion, if you like, into Africa, there's also they've set up various centres for African studies in Chinese universities. So there's an increasing number of African students, and in Guangzhou there's a very large Nigerian population. Some people say it could be 600,000 people who are basically traders and who are ensuring stuff gets put in containers and shipped back to Africa. But I don't know yet whether they've introduced or will introduce low-wage workers from India or Bangladesh. I mean, I haven't seen that in any significant way, but the low-wage labour pool in China has clearly been drying up. So there's that element.
I've got one very quick question.
Okay.
It's not. I don't want to monopolise things. It's important. But this lady mentioned agriculture, and of course, food is rather important. And one very important thing that's happening in China is they are building a huge waterway to move water from the south of China, where it is abundant, to the north of China, which is virtually a desert. Yes. And I can see that being very significant.
Yes, go on.
Yeah.
Okay. So to answer that, in a sense, they already have the Grand Canal, which goes from Hangzhou in the south to Beijing in the north, and that was built during the imperial era many, many hundreds of years ago, but was used to transmit goods to the north of China, which, as you rightly say, is semi-desert. Beijing is a very arid climate. But they now have this massive problem of water shortage in the big cities in northern China. So this is another thing which they're trying to deal with. Southern China is basically warm and wet, and northern China is cold and dry. So another.
Yes, we were in Sri Lanka last year, and we used their motorway. This was, of course, I think, Chinese funded, and the Sri Lankans. The story was the Sri Lankans thought it would bring some work for them as well, but it didn't, because the Chinese imported convicts to build it, who, by the way, didn't know what they were doing. So it was badly built. And I just wondered if you'd come across perhaps examples of that in China
This is very,
itself.
very common. Basically, wherever China is engaged in large-scale construction overseas, and which it is, they largely use indigenous Chinese labour because they're possibly for economic reasons or for reasons of social control, of language, etc. But there's this much broader issue, which Xi Jinping pioneered, which is, you may have heard of, the One Belt, One Road, Yi Dai Yi Lu. And this policy is meant to foster economic development globally. I think it's actually a way of expanding Chinese economic links and investment worldwide. And what commonly happens, and this has happened in Sri Lanka with the port, and it's happening in Pakistan with the port there, it's all Chinese funded, Chinese developed, and the deal is that the national governments basically say, well, we will give you ownership rights for whatever 99 years. Countries now, poor developing countries, have now become increasingly indebted to China. This infrastructure development in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, in Piraeus, in Greece, the Chinese have now taken ownership of the port of Piraeus in Athens. So it's coming soon to a place near you. Rob, you have a question.
Yeah, just one, Chris. Is there any equivalent in China of our system of listed buildings to preserve buildings of historic interest, or do they not care and just knock down anything?
There is. The answer is, I think they didn't care, and basically the objective was simply modernization at any cost, except in the center of Beijing, of course, where Mao ensured that the Forbidden City and the major temples, etc., all were absolutely perfectly preserved, and the bell tower and the drum tower. So all of those elements have been retained. But what has happened is that Chinese local governments have realized that they've, by and large, often gone too far too quickly, and are now trying, rather late in the day, to try to preserve some of the key elements of the cities if they still exist. And one of the great wonders, if you've not been to Xi'an, you can go there and an hour outside see the Terracotta Army. In Xi'an, the walls are still absolutely preserved. And it's about 11 or 15 kilometers of wall, and the road width at the top of the wall is the width of this room. It's spectacular. So you can go up there, take a cycle, and cycle around the walls, or etc. So it's becoming important, but very, very late in the day. But they are managing to save some stuff. Yeah.
I think we're running towards the end of our time. I think 9:30 we are due to be finished. So unless there's any other urgent questions, I think we should say thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
We've covered a lot of interesting points. I think one of the most interesting is the multiplicity of different bodies doing different things, all competition running inside state control.
It's the most ruthless capitalist country there is, but it's ruthless capitalism within a framework set and controlled by the state, and that control has tightened in the last 8 years or so.
I don't know. Yeah.